I wanted to thank everyone for sharing this time with us, and I know it can be very concerning to be out in public, but we have found with the programs that we've been able to do, offering people a safe way to enjoy life and culture and art again is worth more than, just getting up and doing it as we were doing it before the pandemic. So I'm very happy to be able to share this with you, and Dr. Neiberg, I'm going to give it to you.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you, everybody, for braving the rain and coming out. If you'd like to go down to the road, there's a Cézanne just behind the gate. So announced the British economist and art aficionado John Maynard Keynes to some friends from the Bloomsbury group of artists, critics, and writers. Keynes had just returned from a remarkable sale in Paris of thousands of works that Edgar Degas had amassed throughout his life. Degas died in September 1917, nearly penniless, but surrounded by one of the greatest private art collections ever assembled. In March 1918, this incredible gathering of work from more than 40 artists, often discussed in the Paris art world but only ever seen in bits and pieces, went on sale. It included paintings by the influences of Degas' youth, like Delacroix and Ingres, as well as canvases by impressionists like Manet, Renoir, Corot, and Cézanne. Find a place to put these pages. The sale, the most important wartime art event in France or anywhere else in the world, took place even though the German army had begun its massive 1918 spring offensive just 5 days earlier. The stark contrast between the beauty of art and the horror of war first drew me to this topic, and the impact of war runs through the works here in the gallery today and through the movement of modernism more generally. Virtually all of the artists on these walls were themselves veterans or lost close family members to war, and the impact of war is present in most of the labels on the wall here today. Art became, for many of these artists, a means of survival or a means of dealing with their own personal demons. Even as the British Army was fighting for its own survival, Keynes talked the British Treasury into giving him £20,000, roughly $800,000 in today's money, to bid on works for the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square. Charles Holmes, the National Gallery's director, went with Keynes to Paris, shaving off his mustache and wearing glasses he did not need, so that other buyers would not recognize him and try to outbid him. The French might, Holmes feared, colluded to keep key works out of British hands. Holmes was enthralled by the chance to add pieces by Delacroix and Ingres to the National Gallery's collection. They were artists that he thought the museum, quote, badly needed to illustrate the development of modern art. He and Keynes bought Manet's Execution of Maximilian, Delacroix's Portrait of Baron Schwitter, Corot's The Roman Campagna, which you saw on the last slide, Ingres's The Sphinx, Gauguin's The Flower Piece, Seurat's The Couple, and 21 other works, all of which currently hang in the National Gallery, thanks to Keynes's foresight and Holmes's keen eye. Together, they are estimated to be worth more than $110 million today. More on them in just a bit. Keynes wanted to buy a still life with apples by Cézanne, but Holmes thought it unworthy of the National Gallery, so he refused. Even though the two still had £5,000 of the Treasury's money left, Keynes bought it with £500 of his own. Once back in England, Keynes caught a ride to his country house in Sussex with Sir Austen Chamberlain, who had taken him to Paris on the ostensible grounds of including him in an inter-allied conference on war finance. It had been raining heavily, and as a result, Chamberlain's car could not navigate the muddy lane to Keynes's house. So Keynes hid his Cézanne behind a haystack. He then trudged through the mud to tell his story to his friends and neighbors Vanessa Bell, her husband and art critic Clive Bell, and Keynes's sometime romantic partner, the painter Duncan Graham. Sorry, I keep missing a page here. Okay. While Keynes regaled his Bloomsbury friends over dinner in the tranquil English countryside, the German army continued its steady advance west. Anxious to win the war before American soldiers arrived in overwhelming numbers, Germany had gambled everything on one final push. The first of what would be 5 major offensives began on March 21st, and the area you see in pink there is the ground that the Germans gained. Operation Michael struck the British Army about 100 miles to the southeast of the port city of Boulogne, the city through which Keynes and Holmes had recently entered and departed France under the protection of British airships. The Western Front, for so long so static, had become mobile again. A few days later, the Germans introduced a new weapon to this terrible war. Soon to be called the Paris gun, it was the largest artillery piece ever built. And you can see on the left, those are men standing underneath the barrel to give you a perspective of how big this thing was. Weighing 256 tons, it had to be fired from specially designed concrete-reinforced railway sidings because no road or natural surface could withstand the recoil that it produced. The massive gun could fire a 238mm shell more than 80 miles, so far that the gunners had to take the curvature and rotation of the Earth into account when aiming it. Before landing on its target, the shell rose 25 miles above the Earth's surface, making it then the highest point ever reached by a man-made object. At that altitude, the shell faced little wind resistance, allowing it to travel to its destination in Paris in approximately 3 minutes. Not nearly enough time to allow unsuspecting Parisians to find their way to the relative safety of a basement or a metro station. This is one of the first buildings hit by a Paris gun shell. On March 29th, Good Friday as it turned out, just after Keynes and Holmes had left the city, a Paris gun shell struck the Saint-Gervais church next to Paris's Hôtel de Ville. The roof of the Renaissance structure collapsed under the impact, killing 91 worshippers and wounding 68 others. Among those killed was 25-year-old Rosemarie Ormonde, the longtime model and muse for her uncle, the American artist John Singer Sargent. Here is a portrait that he made of her. Her husband, Robert André Michel, was an artist, archivist, and historian of medieval France, as well as the son of a legendary artist of his own, André Michel. Robert André went to the Western Front with the French army in 1914 and was killed in action near Soissons in October of that year. Rosemarie, still a newlywed, turned her grief into action, joining a volunteer nursing unit that cared for blinded French soldiers. And as many of you know, John Singer Sargent's great work of art that came out of the First World War was about blinded soldiers. Her death struck Paris and the art world particularly hard. While Parisians suffered from the shells of the Paris gun, the Germans kept attacking. Americans at last began arriving in large numbers, and a second sale of Degas art took place. From May 6th to May 8th, a collection of 336 of Degas' own works went on the auction block. Thousands of Parisians braved the dangers to see a public viewing of a sample of the works the day before the sale began. It was a beautiful Sunday, reported one Paris newspaper, serious and dignified as the war demanded. The crowd came to pay homage to this grand French master, affirming one more time the supremacy of fine ideals and the eternity of art. It was a comforting spectacle, reconfirming that we survived despite all the catastrophe. It was the largest art exhibit in wartime Europe, and compared with the hundreds of pieces that were sold in March, the Degas sale represented one of the largest and most important ever assembled anywhere. But they were so much more than that, and I'd like to tell you about them here today. The Degas sales are a great story in and of themselves, but here I want to use them to speak to three themes. First, the sales symbolize a major shift in power, including power in the art world, from France to those nations which had profited from the war, especially the recently neutral United States, which had profited enormously from its 3 years of neutrality. Second, the Degas sale prompted questions about what France and the Allies more generally were fighting for, and how their art showed the contrast between themselves and the barbarity of the enemy. Third, the sale speaks to the shift in artistic styles from Impressionism to Post-Impressionism to the modernism that is on display in this terrific exhibit here today. I know how to amass beautiful paintings, Edgar Degas once told a friend, but not money. Degas used most of what he had earned in the 1880s to pay off his family's banking debts from the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. Starting in the 1890s, he began trading for or buying works by old masters like Delacroix and Ingres, as well as by the best of the new generation of artists like Manet and Renoir. He was a regular fixture at auction houses and galleries, buying pieces that caught his eye and terrifying gallery owners who knew the influence of Degas' opinion through the Paris art world. Occasionally, he even outbid himself in his zeal to buy a piece that he particularly wanted. Degas' tenacity in collecting became the stuff of legend in the Paris art world. He had, for example, spent years tracking down and acquiring the pieces of Delacroix's Execution of Maximilian, which an art dealer years earlier had cut up, thinking that the sections might bring more money than the entire canvas. Degas bought and restored other works, raising their value, but more importantly for Degas, giving him a chance to study technique and style. Whenever he needed money, the Impressionist art dealer of choice, Paul Durand-Ruel, tried to sell some of the paintings on the artist's behalf. But as Durand-Ruel later recalled, for 30 years, Degas wanted nothing to go out of his studio. He tended to treat the paintings, one friend observed, like a library, using them for reference and study, as he himself went through different phases of artistic style, from historical realism to landscape to Impressionism. By the time he stopped collecting around 1905, Degas had 5,148 paintings and sketches stored in his respectable middle-class apartment on the Rue Victor Massé in Paris. He had batches of small sketches by Daumier, Gavarni, Manet, and others lying around in boxes or piles on the floor. Several of Degas' most prominent pieces hung in the rooms of his apartment, where the misanthropic artist hosted his increasingly infrequent guests. Partly because so few people had actually seen them, those paintings were talked about all over Paris, and later sold for some of the highest prices. Degas kept the rest of the collection, including his own work, in a dusty, cramped studio on the third floor that almost no one saw. Paintings were piled in corners, shoved into cupboards, and stacked on top of one another. Degas rarely let anyone touch them, not even to dust them or to remove spider webs. Some giants of the art world, like Durand-Ruel, and one of Degas' few remaining close friends, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania's own Mary Cassatt, had seen parts of this enthralling and mysterious collection. No one other than Degas himself had seen it all, and it's likely that even he had not laid eyes on many of the pieces in many years. Degas moved a short distance away in 1911 when the owners of his building sold it to build something much more modern in its place. His new apartment at the foot of Montmartre was smaller, dingier, and far less suited to storing great works of art. Still, Degas only allowed Durand-Ruel to take away a few large canvases for safekeeping in his gallery. The rest he jealously hoarded. As he grew older, guests became even less frequent. All of this mystery only added to the aura of the collection. What exactly did the old master have in that apartment? And what would happen to it when he died? Degas had often talked about building a museum to house his collection, not only to display the pieces he had acquired, but to properly contextualize his own art's place in the pantheon of French painting and drawing. He visited similar museums built for the works of artists like Degas and Fabre, but in the end, Degas proved a better art collector than a museum bureaucrat. As much as he wanted his work to remain in France, however, he bristled at the idea of the French government, most of whose politicians he despised, having any control over his masterpieces. Degas had supported the reactionary forces that had lined up against the falsely accused Jewish army officer Alfred Dreyfus during the tectonic scandal that now bears Dreyfus's name. The anti-Semitic and anti-Republican Degas lost many friends as a result of his support of the anti-Dreyfusards during that scandal. He later came to detest the Third Republic that governed France. He'd also been horrified by the humiliating 2-year bureaucratic nightmare that Gustave Caillebot's widow had suffered when she tried to donate her husband's collection to the modern art wing of the Musée du Luxembourg. After a painter from the establishment École des Beaux-Arts dismissed the Caillebot collection as garbage, the state slashed its offering price and agreed only to a temporary exhibition of paintings, not a permanent museum or a dedicated space in the Luxembourg. The Luxembourg's collection later formed the core of the Musée d'Orsay. When Degas died in September 1917, therefore, he left behind no money and no plans for a museum, only a large tax bill and 2 contradictory wills that promised the collection alternatively to his brother René and to the 4 children of a sister who had moved to Argentina. Mary Cassatt fought for the rights of one of the children, a daughter named Jeanne who had moved up from southern France to Paris to care for her uncle in his final months. The family dispute turned really ugly. An angry Mary Cassatt wrote to a friend that René was trying to deprive the rightful heirs of their share of the estate because he needed the money to care for his many illegitimate children. In normal times, the French government might have bought the entire collection from heirs willing to accept less money in order to see this incredible collection of French art become the property of the state. But in this case, the heirs despised one another, and the winter of 1917-1918 was surely not a normal time. The feuding family therefore decided to sell the collection at auction rather than go to court over its ownership, but not before one of Degas' brothers destroyed 50 paintings that Degas had made of prostitutes. He worried that the gallery might one day organize a show of Degas erotica that might harm the reputation of the family's banking business. Most of the collection was in what one observer called a piteous state when Degas died, but those who saw it were astounded by its quality. Paris art dealer Paul Jameau saw Degas' legendary Famille Bellelli, which later attracted one of the auction's highest prices, rolled up in a dusty corner in the apartment's kitchen. Jameau arranged for it to be properly stretched, cleaned, and placed in a suitable frame. He was astonished by the results, and no doubt realized how much more money the dealers could make if the rest of the pieces received similar levels of care and presentation. How many other pictures of even greater interest, finished or only sketched in, were also hidden, buried under the dust of the studio, Jameau said. Jameau also discovered piles of notebooks Degas had used to prepare for landscapes he had painted in the 1890s. They showed his work in various stages of design and development. It is a practically unknown Degas that is being revealed to us, Jameau remarked. As he and others no doubt intended, stories like these only increased interest in the collection as they circulated through Paris and beyond. Back in London, they had already reached Clive Bell, who mentioned it to his friend John Maynard Keynes. Getting this collection ready for sale proved a difficult task. The heirs allowed Durand Ruel, another gallery owner named Ambroise Vollard, and their small staff to enter the apartment only on weekdays and only between the hours of 9 to 12 and 2 to 4. The French lunch hour must still be respected. Members of the family and their representatives often looked over their shoulders while they worked. At all other times, court officials sealed the apartment. Durand Ruel's gallery had lost all but 3 of its employees to the war, and Paul's brother George had gone to New York to run the gallery's American office. More on that in a bit. Leaving the legendary house badly understaffed. Paul even wrote to the army, unsuccessfully begging for permission for one of his framing specialists to come back to Paris to help. The shortage of workers meant that at age 87, Durand Ruel did much of the work himself in Degas' unheated and dusty apartment. Only after he and Vollard had cataloged, recorded, and stamped each piece as belonging to the Atelier Degas collection could it leave the studio for the much better working environment of the city's major galleries, many of them nearby on the Rue Lafitte. This is a picture of Durand Ruel's gallery. If you look really closely where that white arrow is, that's Renoir's Luncheon of the Voting Party on the wall. There are at least 3 Monets that I found on the wall, including one of the famous Giverny Japanese bridges. So this is really a remarkable gallery. And I should stop to note here just briefly, Degas had no Monets in his own collection because he thought that a painter who painted outside was not a serious artist. So just for that. It took almost 3 months for excited and eager art experts and gallery owners to clean and frame the pieces. It was the first time that even a veteran of the art world like Durand Ruel had seen many of these masterpieces, some produced by the greatest artists in French history. Wartime shortages of glass, wood, and chemicals made needed repairs difficult, and the number of artists serving on the Western Front impeded efforts to touch up and restore those works that needed some professional attention. In many cases, inferior wood and cheap gilt substituted for materials worthy of the paintings. Still, the team worked hard through the winter to get the collection ready for sale and insured against war damage. They were particularly worried about the gallery's glass roof there. They were worried that a German shell might strike the building and destroy everything inside. Durand Ruel also photographed every piece, both for the collection of a catalog and to guard against dealers trying to pass off second-rate work as belonging to the collection. With the anticipation and excitement came profound anxiety in a society fighting for its survival. What Degas had kept hidden for so long would now go not to a museum for the benefit of French heritage, but to the highest bidders, or what one French critic derisively called the lust of the connoisseurs, a word that usually carried with it a negative connotation of amateurishness. In the eyes of the professionals, French art was about to be commodified in the crassest possible way. In the words of another French critic, the greed of the heirs and the profit-seeking gallery owners would, quote, extract every last centime from the works that the master insisted on hiding. If France lost the war, of course, the paintings might even end up in Germany as part of war reparations. Contemporaries immediately saw the symbolism of holding the sale as the Germans were continuing their march towards Paris. Could Degas' death play a role in rejuvenating France? Could it remind the French people of the role that art could play in the mobilization for the final phase of the war? Could the sale of the Degas masterpieces help show the French people why they had to keep fighting? Maybe by celebrating the life and legacy of what one French newspaper called a man who ranks among our demigods, the French could show what they had given to humanity worldwide. The composers Claude Debussy and Louis Boulanger had both died within days of the first Degas sale, increasing both the sense of a nation in mourning and transition, as well as reinforcing a nostalgic vision of France as the great center of civilization. Having given so much of the world, France could not suffer defeat at the hands of the Hun. Degas and his collection thus emerged as a potent symbol of why France had to win the war. As a man who cared above all for the beauty of his art, he died a pauper rather than part with even a portion of this marvelous collection. Celebrating him and the works he purchased could show the stark differences between a humanistic France worth dying for and a barbarian Germany determined to destroy her. It could also show how France differed from its materialistic Anglo-Saxon allies. With the exception of a few Japanese prints and a handful of cassettes, virtually the entirety of the collection was French. The competition at the sales was fierce, even with the war having driven many traditional buyers out of contention. With art prices rising, the paintings from the Atelier Degas sales certainly seemed to be a good investment, even for buyers who knew little to nothing about art itself. These people were, of course, just the kind of amateurish connoisseurs that Degas had despised. But some of the buyers were highly knowledgeable collectors. Many had been seeking a Degas or a Delacroix for years. The French government, moreover, had recently announced an increase in the luxury tax effective on April 1st from 10% to 20%. Rumors also swirled around the city that the government might ban the export of French art until the end of the war. Both pieces of information would have incentivized interested parties, especially those who were not French, to buy. In this environment, professional estimates of prices rose far beyond what many dealers thought reasonable. Because of how quickly the sales were organized and the wartime restrictions on travel and communications, Americans did not have the chance to attend in person. Catalogs did not arrive into the United States until well after both sales had ended, further hampering the efforts of Americans to send bids to French buyers on their behalf. The Met was the only American museum that found out in time to be represented. Paul Durand-Ruel's brother George, the one who had moved to New York to run the family's American business, knew how much the Met wanted a Degas and an ingress. He made sure that the museum's directors knew about the sales in time to assemble the list of desired works and the amount of money they were willing to pay. George then sent the list to his brother Paul, whose gallery was one of the host venues for the sales. The Met's director, Bryson Burroughs, noted that, quote, "The most conspicuous lack in the museum is the absence of a painting by Degas." Burroughs also wanted another chance to buy the portraits of Madame and Monsieur Leblanc by Ingres that had escaped his grasp in 1909. He had seen the works during his lone visit to Degas' studio and had fallen in love with them. He had even sketched them in his notebook to try to convince the Met's buyers of their value. But in the end, it didn't matter, because Degas refused to sell at any price. Almost a decade later, Burroughs rushed to the Paris sales to redeem his and the museum's earlier failures. He was optimistic that he could find what he called a stunner at a price that even the museum's purchasing committee would approve. Hopefully, that stunner would be the Leblanc portraits. Established French art dealers dominated the sales, buying whatever they could, either on behalf of a rich client or in the hopes of flipping the purchases later for a large profit. Degas' heirs did quite well, from the enormous demand and inflated prices that one newspaper thought defied all common sense. The family's total haul amounted to almost $40 million in today's money, even after paying the taxes and the gallery fees. Degas' brothers may have wanted him to go into the family banking business, but he proved to have a better eye for investments than any of them. There was surely an irony in this most private of collections being displayed so visibly. Degas had sometimes talked about building his museum far out into the Paris suburb and away from metro lines, so that only people he deemed worthy of collections would have the means to see it. Degas did not think that his art belonged to the people, only to those with the proper taste and refinement to appreciate it. But in 1918, this collection would receive more attention than even he could ever have imagined, as Parisians of all classes redefined what art meant in a time of war. The dispersal of this collection, recognized from an artist recognized as early as 1880 as one of the best that France had ever produced, worried French observers. Degas had dreamed about building his museum in part to keep the collection together and away from, as he himself once said, the claws of newly rich Americans. Some of Degas' art, however, was already in the United States, mostly in the New York City mansion of Louisine Havemeyer, whom Mary Cassatt had introduced to Degas in the 1870s. The Degas sale could well lead to a further dispersal, not just of Degas' own works, but those of the French masters he had carefully acquired over the years. In a blooded country, this event was a dream for the British and the Americans, noted a centennial history of the sales from one of the other host galleries. But it wasn't just Americans and Britons who were enlisting the service of art buyers. Swedes, Swiss, Japanese, and Danish collectors, had their eyes on the sales as well. Like the Americans, they came from countries that had made huge sums in the war, putting them in a position not only to afford the wartime tax on art, but to outbid their French rivals. When money failed, the French sometimes tried shame. When Charles Holmes bid on Delacroix's portrait of Baron Schwitter, French buyers yelled at him, "That is for the Louvre, monsieur." Holmes got it anyway, in addition to the 26 other pieces he bought on behalf of the National Gallery. Would Degas have been happy with this? Asked one of his friends. I doubt it. Indeed, he would be furious. The French government, fighting a war and deeply in debt to the British and the Americans, did what it could to fulfill what one newspaper called its national duty to purchase as many works as possible on behalf of the French people. Nevertheless, it managed to buy just 17 pieces, although one of them was Degas' Famille Bellelli, a much talked about masterpiece that brought one of the highest prices of any work at either sale. Even that indulgence brought criticism from those who argued that the French would have been better off spending the money on a much debated hospital for soldiers suffering from tuberculosis. The skyrocketing prices on the rest of the collection were simply too high for the French government to be competitive. The Louvre's buyers wanted Delacroix's portrait of Baron Schwitter and Manet's of Armand Brune, but both were well out of reach. The Louvre received praise from art critics for buying a few pieces at relatively low prices, such as Manet's Madame Manet on a blue sofa, which one critic thought was the only piece in the whole sale that sold for its true market value. French observers hoped that anonymous buyers would eventually bequeath their works to the French state, but a survey of the catalog shows that only a small percentage of the pieces are in France today. More on that in just a minute. As noted earlier, 27 of the paintings are in the National Gallery in London, thanks to the quick thinking of John Maynard Keynes. Then a fast-rising foreign currency and trade specialist in the British Treasury, Keynes heard about the sale and decided to act. Thinking quickly and sensing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, he devised a clever scheme to get some of the paintings without asking the government for any money in wartime. He approached the Assistant Secretary of Treasury and the powerful Lord Curzon, leader of the House of Lords and a trustee of the National Gallery. He convinced them that in the Assistant Treasury Secretary's recollection, quote, French indebtedness to this country is on so colossal a scale that there is no prospect, even within the quite distant future, of Britain being repaid its loans. So, Keynes asked, why not leverage French debt to add priceless works of art to the National Gallery's collection? Keynes proposed asking the French to deliver the equivalent of £20,000 in French banknotes to the British Embassy in Paris, ostensibly to resolve a local cash flow issue of the kind that Keynes's office routinely handled. The British would then deduct that amount from the total amount that the French owed the British government, the very same amount that Keynes suspected they would never be able to repay in any case. As Holmes noted, quote, we decided that a few good pictures would be worth more to us in the end than all of the dubious paper that financed French debt. With a major inter-allied conference on finance coincidentally occurring in Paris at the same time as the first Degas sale, the French needed British help and could hardly say no to what seemed like a routine request. Keynes and Holmes would officially travel to Paris as members of the British Commission to the conference, deposit the cash into a respectable Paris bank account, go to the Degas sale, and, in effect, use French money to buy French art for Britain. Kind of genius. Keynes was a smart dude. The sale went on even as the great battle outside Paris continued. Charles Holmes recalled hearing a dull boom around 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the first day of the sale, and realizing it was the sound of the war approaching the French capital. 15 minutes later, another boom, even closer, sent several terrified people out of the sale room, but the defiant auctioneers stayed. So too did Holmes, who soon profited from the absence of many of his rival buyers. He bought Ingres's Monsieur de Norvins for much less than what he thought it was worth. French officials were understandably desperate to find the gun that was causing so much damage and instilling so much fear. They narrowed the search by using a complicated method called sound ranging. Specially trained French soldiers, many of them musicians in civilian life, sitting several miles apart, used a series of sensitive microphones to record and graph the sound of a shell being fired. Engineers could then triangulate the sound waves and thereby calculate their meeting point, which corresponded to the approximate location of the gun muzzle. This method held promise, but it would not be easy. To mask the distinctive sound pattern that the Paris gun produced, the Germans frequently fired as many as 30 other artillery pieces at the same time in order to flood the microphones with vibrations. Working carefully and diligently, sound ranging technicians soon isolated the correct sound waves and placed the Paris gun in a forest outside the cathedral town of Laon, approximately 75 miles northeast of Paris, and coincidentally not very far from where Robert André was killed in 1914. Now they knew roughly where to look. The French could focus their investigations on a specific area and consult relevant intelligence reports. They found one from French pilots who had flown over the area on March 6th and spotted what looked like a mile-long railway spur running into the Saint-Gobain forest from the village of Crépy near Laon. Remnants of it are still visible on Google Earth. You can still see it if you look carefully. That line, the French now knew, hosted a massive artillery gun unlike anything anyone had ever seen. But knowing where it was and what it was did not necessarily make it any easier to destroy. From March 23rd to August 9th, 3 different Paris guns tormented the French capital, although they did not come close to creating the chaos and panic the Germans had hoped for. The guns fired a total of 367 shells into the city, killing a total of 256 Parisians and wounding 620 more. Paris gun shells struck the back of the famous La Madeleine Cathedral. One landed inside Père Lachaise Cemetery, and in one particularly tragic case, hit a maternity hospital. A shell that landed in the Tuileries Gardens left a crater 30 feet wide and 4 feet deep. Paris newspapers reprinted Kaiser Wilhelm's public and unseemly congratulations to the gun's maker. "Your new cannon has proven itself brilliantly," he wrote to the House of Krupp. "I express to you my imperial recognition for this exploit of German science and labor." Parisians, scared though they may have been, did not panic. "Parisians bombed. Buy art," read one headline. "Paris holds. Its art holds," read another. The Degas sales symbolized to many in the capital the persistence of French culture and love of art, even through the worst of times. Shells might be falling on the city, and France's army might be fighting for its life just to the east of the capital, but Parisians were proving worthy of the sacrifice of their soldiers. The symbolism of the sale happening during this existential moment mattered far more than Degas' forlorn hopes for his collection to be displayed together in a single dedicated museum of French art. American Art News said that the sale gave, quote, "convincing proof, if any were needed, of the bravery and sang-froid of the French." The Figaro argued the popularity of the sale demonstrated, quote, "how much faith everyone here has in our victory." And one American newspaper argued that the sale's high prices proved that French buyers were willing to invest in their own future. The sale also led British, French, and American observers to remark on the contrast between France's humanistic civilisation and Germany's barbaric culture. The former stood for the beauty of art, the latter for the exploitation of science and labor to target defenseless civilians. Writing at the time of the second Degas sale, the New York Tribune's art critic contrasted France's triumph of civilization to Germany's degradation of morals. "Even German nudes," he wrote, "were pure pornography and naked indecency, quite unlike the romantic charm of their French equivalents. German art," he observed, "inspired bestial mobs to violence and moral rottenness, while French art inspired life, health, confidence, and hope." French observers, of course, agreed. Henri Lavedon, writing in L'Illustration, argued that Degas' collection was, quote, "a protest against the villainy of an enemy who, piling up all manners of crime, has found joy in the destruction and the defilement of beauty." The mere fact that France was holding an art sale at all, while its future hung in the balance, was therefore an act of national defiance and proved that France had a passion for beauty, defying the Hun forever. The sales also marked a shift in artistic styles, from the beauty of pre-war Impressionism to the complexity and ambiguity in the modernism on display here. Even before the war ended, artists affected by the war were beginning to reimagine their craft. Modernism offered a language and a way of understanding the horrors of the years of 1914 to 1918 that the art Degas collected never could. Neither the romantic heroism of Delacroix nor the serene landscapes of Corot could capture this new mood. Instead, veterans and artists like James McVeigh, whose Français Inconnu is on the wall here, and realists like John Singer Sargent and William Orpin turned their talents to memorializing the victims of the war. Pacifists like Katie Kovacs and Julius Bloch, both of whom are also represented here in this gallery, used their art to make much more overtly political statements about the futility of war. This one, of course, just being called War. This is one of my absolute favorites. These are statues that Katie Kovacs made of parents grieving. These two statues are in the very same cemetery where her son Peter is buried. He was killed in the war's first weeks, coincidentally about the same time that Rosemarie's husband, Robert André Michel, was killed, and not that far away. Veterans like Egon Schiele and Max Beckmann, also here on the walls, turned their trauma into highly disturbing works, showing the suffering that the war had inflicted on people, on societies, and on nature alike. Perhaps because this new art was so jarring and so unsettling, the Degas collection remained in high demand. Unlike the works of McVeigh, Beckmann, and Colditz, the beauty of the Degas collection did not require the viewer to relive the dislocations and traumas of the war. Instead, he or she could escape back into a time before the war that most now remember nostalgically as a vanished golden age, the perfect Belle Epoque. Paul Durand-Ruel, working with Parisian art dealer Jacques Seligman, brought most of the Degas they bought at the sale to New York City in 1921. The 1918 sales had been rushed so quickly that too few Americans had had time to see a catalog or place orders through their Paris-based buyers. Because of the war, of course, even American buyers who would have liked to attend in person could not. As I mentioned earlier, only one American got to Paris in time. Durand-Ruel, therefore, purchased 165 pieces with his own money and worked with Seligman to purchase 69 more, with the idea already in mind to sell many of them to Americans once the enthusiasm for art began to dry up in Europe. Theirs was a smart and forward-thinking business decision, as the European market indeed dried up as a post-war recession struck Europe in 1921. America, on the other hand, had buyers with money to spend who were eager to get a glimpse of some of Europe's great treasures. The colors in the paintings dazzled New York art buyers, who had only seen the black and white photographs that Seligman had sent ahead to whet appetites. That the sale was happening in the United States at all proved to many that, quote, the center of gravity in the auction room has shifted from Paris to New York. The sale was, as one New York art critic wrote, quote, an event of which we would have once heard only by cable, as occurring at Christie's or Paris's Hotel Drouot. Now it was happening in New York City's Plaza Hotel, and attracting buyers beyond the usual agents for J.P. Morgan, Henry Clay Frick, and Louisine Havemeyer. The sale was then the highest grossing art event in American history, and as you can see, it represents a significant chunk of where the Degas paintings ended up. Despite his best efforts, Degas had, in the end, failed to keep his collection out of the claws of rich Americans, or even out of the gaze of ordinary ones. Thank you very much.